Thank you, Sunita, for that wonderful introduction. Probal, good to be back again with you.
Thank you.
My opinion is that General Sundarji, theoretically brilliant, but all the operations that he led to one disaster after another. So, I had that thing in mind that, oh God, he's the man behind Blue Star, he's the mind behind Brasstacks, he's the mind behind Op Pawan. Thousands of Indian soldiers have died. We've been in embarrassing diplomatic situations. Bofors happened in his watch. But when I read the book, I had to change my opinion. And of course, spoke with Probal as well. Probal, first off, 5 assassinations. What are the 5 assassinations?
Yes.
Let's ask the audience first. How many of you can figure out which 5 assassinations we're talking about? 2 or 3? Okay. Anyone knows all 5? No. None of the authors. You know 3?
I know Indira Gandhi.
Yeah, okay.
There would be Rajiv Gandhi in decade.
Right, okay.
One of the Pakistani premiers. Jao Thakur sent decade.
Yeah. You're close.
Where Candy Toffee Prize.
3. No, you got to get all 5. I'm sorry, no.
You can buy a signed copy of Brasstacks.
Yeah, and you have to buy the book as well. No, but 2 more to go. Anyone with the other 2 assassinations?
General Vaidya.
Yes. Okay, 4. And the 5th? You're preaching to the converted. Probal, I think we'll find out. Everyone knows everything. Assassination.
So
Yes.
there's a 6th Harchan Singh Lobowal.
There's a 7th Atwal. There's an 8th Shabet Singh. So
there's the reason why the 5 and the arms deal. But yes, there's an arms deal as well.
There is an arms deal as well, and I think everyone knows the arms deal. Yeah, I think we did, right? The Bofors deal. But Probal, everyone knows about these assassinations very clearly. Everyone knows about the arms deal. What is it about General Sundarji that drew you to write the book?
So, when I started thinking about the book, what drew me to writing about him is the decade that we spoke about. Earlier in the previous panel, we spoke about how decades are important. 1980s, for many of us, growing up in that decade, in our mind's eye, in the recesses of our history, we had all of these events. I thought that, one of the central characters, when we look at 1980s, it was a decade, tempestuous, turbulent, had all the action, non-stop action, right from start to finish. You had, all kinds. You had India sending the first man to space. Many won't remember today, Rakesh Sharma. You also had the first World Cup victory of cricket, Kapil Dev, 1983. You had a gas disaster in Bhopal. That was a low. You had the several insurgency movements, Khalistani movement, the early rumblings of issues in Kashmir, which happened later. But so many things happened. And the Indian Army fought in the plains of Punjab, operated in the deserts of Rajasthan, in the heights of Siachen, in the mountains of Arunachal, in the swamps of Jaffna, in the jungles of the northeast, and at the end, in the island of Maldives. All of this bore the stamp and the signature, the legacy of this man, General Sundarji. So I realized that 1980s, and which is why, we could look at a wide sweep or we could look at a deep dive. If you look at a deep dive, look at 1980s, you have General Sundarji virtually straddling the entire decade with the highs and lows, the blunders, the successes, the controversies, etc. But there was not a single moment when there was no drama in this extraordinary grand theatre that was his career.
Oh, interesting that, now that you put it, I'm just visualizing it. Ladakh in the north, the LAC, the northeast, plains of Punjab, Rajasthan, right down Jammu, Sri Lanka, and all in the tenure of one army chief. Just 820 days.
That's right.
Incredible. How did he manage to pack in so much into 820 days?
So if I were to stretch it a little bit, it was about 1,000 days. It started when he was Western Army Commander and Blue Star happened. So many of these events kept happening at a time when, there was Cold War. We spoke about this in the previous panel. There was also a set of events that was happening. There was a change in government. You had a new government. You had Rajiv Gandhi and his set of technocrats and young political leaders who wanted to change India in a hurry. And you had General Sundarji, who was close to Arun Singh, who was the Minister of State for Defence then, to Rajiv Gandhi. So they all seemed to be on the same page. They sang from the same hymn sheet, so to say. And then you had all of these events happening. So Sundarji, I call him a destiny's child. He's like sitting on the ringside, watching all of these events unfold and having a part to play in each one of them in one way or the other.
Fascinating. And Sundarji was Western Army commander under Mrs. Gandhi when she was Prime Minister. Op Blue Star was the single factor that led to her assassination. And one would have thought that the Western Army commander who oversaw a very controversial operation as Blue Star was, he wouldn't make it. And as you said, he's destiny's child. Do you think he had kind of planned it in such a way? Was it a meeting of minds? You have a very young Prime Minister in Rajiv Gandhi. He was 42 when he became Prime Minister? Our youngest Prime Minister. You have a very ambitious army chief, General Sundarji, who's also all about computers, right? Was it a meeting of minds then?
Yes, I think so. I was talking to one of the army officers who said in 1982, he was at an exercise and General Sundarji was operating on computers. And he had been telling young officers then that you've got to be proficient in computers because this will be the kind of warfare, the kind of strategic vision, strategic thinking that one will need to have in times to come. So he was thinking ahead of his times. And as I said, the political dispensation of that day was also in a hurry to get India across to a different 21st century. So, when we talk about Blue Star was an event which nobody really came out as a victim. Sundarji always was heavily impacted by what happened in Blue Star with several deaths. We can talk about how these assassinations and the arms deal linked to Sundarji in one way or the other. But it was General Sundarji's call to go for Blue Star. That was his advice to Mrs. Gandhi. I do not particularly blame him for taking that action because the circumstances had been such that the entire set of events before Blue Star, which was the political dispensations advocating of Bendrawale, propping him up and creating a dragon which they couldn't control. He had gone out of control and Bendrawale was moving around with swords and guns in Bombay and Delhi and everywhere. And finally, it was almost like an inevitable action that was laid at the army's door. Where I fault General Sundarji was he overstepped General Vaidya's his role, and he connected directly with the Prime Minister. He did, yes.
He bypassed his chief.
Yes, he did. And he bypassed, that was his personality. He was somebody who was impatient, brilliant, at times reckless. So I write about that in the book as well, that I didn't hold back my punches. Well, he did make mistakes, and I have said that he did.
Do you think he's India's best army chief?
I think he was India's most important military leader. Not perhaps, maybe arguably the best, perhaps one of the best. But we can debate till evening on that. But one of the things that I consistently maintain is that he was the most important military leader India has had, because all of these events happened under his watch, and it actually shaped the way the country was moving. I also talk about how strategic thinking was hauled by the bootstraps by Sundarji from that decade and hauled into the 21st century. The thinking, the ability to think big, that is the one big change that he did. So I think he had a very important kind of contribution, given that he arrived at a time when 1970s had happened. We were in a state of stupor and somnolent, virtually not very, not very much alive to the world that was that was around us, we were basking in the glory of our 1971 victory. So in the 70s, nothing really happened. When Sundarji arrived, tanks moving at 10 miles an hour in 1981. That's the time he thought of moving the tanks at 80 miles an hour, which hurt a lot of people. There was a lot of wear and tear. People didn't like the whole idea, but that was Sundarji.
Absolutely. And Probal, we were just talking outside just before our session about the Mumbai connect to General Sundarji and the 1980s. And it just suddenly struck me that way back this is in the late 80s, I think 88, 89, my father was in the Navy. So we were in one of the multi-story buildings here at the end of this road, Colaba Causeway, where the road literally ends. And one day I saw a bungalow there in front of the building. And suddenly there were high walls being built around that bungalow. The name kind of vanished from the bungalow. And I asked my dad, staying there. Strange house. It's like got pillboxes, and I won't tell you where the house is, but that is the house where General Brar lives till date. And that's where he had moved in after General Vaidya's assassination. Yeah. So, he's still there. And he must be 95, 96?
He's late 80s, early 90s, I think.
Early 90s.
But he looks much younger.
Right. He's very active.
Man,
yeah. But, so it's interesting what you said about General Sundarji as being the man who brought the Indian Army into the 21st century. And you had an Army 2000 vision as well, which they had crafted together, these chiefs. It was, I think, General Krishna Rao, General Sundarji on board.
Yes. Yeah.
But here's the thing. General Sundarji always wanted that big battle. He wanted that big standoff with Pakistan. He wanted a 1971 moment. Instead, what he got was Sri Lanka, Punjab, and I think Kashmir hadn't started there.
Yeah.
So, do you think that now he was the conventional army chief? He wanted a conventional battle. He got counterinsurgency. And now 4 decades later, the Indian army is reorienting itself to fighting a major conventional battle. Because CI ops is dying out.
Yeah.
You think Sundarji is more relevant today than he was back then?
There are two parts to it. I would like to say that he had prepared the thinking then for the era that was to unfold.
Master tanks, armored
the big armor formations, big thinking, integrated battle groups, all of these things he had been talking about then at that time. And Brasstacks, we spoke about Brasstacks briefly in the context of Able Archer. So he was someone who would think big right from the time that he was a young officer. The ability to think big, the ability to strategize, the ability to take risks. Some would come off, some wouldn't, but that didn't stop him. That is the way he thought, which outfoxed a lot of people. When we talk about the big thinking ability, it outfoxed the Pakistanis, it outfoxed the Chinese, because they were used to a very cautious and rather conservative Indian approach. And Sundarji was anti-status quo. I call him the most anti-status quoist military leader that India had had. Most important, and the most anti-status quo. He challenged all of the conventions. He believed in the big plans, the big strategies, and he is the only chief. That's the other way to look at it. The other dimension is the only chief or a military leader to have influenced the political decision making, influenced the political dispensation in a democracy such as India. There was nobody else. There's nobody else before him. There's nobody else after him. He, for good or for worse, all of these events that we spoke about, all of these assassinations and the deal and all of this, Sundarji had a hand. He had an influence on the political dispensation of the day. And that is, coming back to your point about the big thinking part. So he loved the big classical battle scenarios and he excelled in them. But unfortunately for him, during that time, there were also what we call as the dirty little wars. When you go to Sri Lanka, when we had Punjab, so he had those as well. Where he had his highs in the big battle scenarios and the lows in...
And he was still fighting in the northeast, you were fighting the Nagas.
Yes, he was doing that. So, so he had, I think the canvas is so big that, you had a mix of the good and the bad, the highs and the lows. when we talk about the big battle scenarios, that's what it was. He could amass 400,000 troops into and across services. That was a one trial services exercise that we had, Brasstacks, and it rattled Pakistan. Somebody spoke about General Zia as well, but and we talk about how the assassination story happened. But it rattled Pakistan to the extent that the president flew into India, attended a cricket match with Rajiv Gandhi in Jaipur, and you have this old picture of Zia shaking hands with Zahir Abbas and Imran Khan certainly, there was Sunil Gavaskar and some of the others, Kapil and others. So he attended that. He realized that Sundarji, because of that ability to think big, what he had done is, he knew that Pakistanis were very strong on the Punjab front. He had seen that in 1971 war and 65. So he ensured that we could hold off the Pakistanis' attack in Punjab if there was one. The military exercise is one for the benefit of everyone, is to test your ability to mobilize, test your ability of firepower, the ability to coordinate, etc. So all of that Sundarji had done. The idea was to focus not on Punjab. Punjab was to hold off the Pakistani charge. It was Rajasthan, which India had not done earlier. The idea, to take your mind back to the map of India along the Punjab-Rajasthan border, the idea was to drive through the deserts of Rajasthan into the Pakistani deserts and 500 miles inside, take out the Pakistani nuclear facility, then fledgling one of Kahuta, which was what had rattled Zia. He flew into India. He said, no, this is going to completely dismantle my nuclear plan. He flew into India. He bought peace, literally, with Rajiv Gandhi, because he said, well, Rajiv is a nice guy. Zia had conquered everything in Pakistan that had to be done. Possibly he realized that this was one moment of him going for the Nobel Prize. And so India and Pakistan started bilateral talks, secretary talks, etc.
I know someone else who wants a Nobel Prize, at least as of last year.
Yeah. Yes.
Not this year.
Not this year, certainly not. But if
This year you probably get the other invention that Alfred Nobel is.
The dynamite. But that's another lesson, that if you don't give a Nobel Prize to somebody, you could probably go and...
No, but there's another aspect of your book, Probal. When I was reading it, a couple of months back, I was at this seminar and we were talking, a panel discussion. There was a former DGMO sitting there next to me. And I was saying that, look, Pakistan occupied Kashmir. We don't have any plans for capturing it. It's never been on the... So he said, I'll talk to you after. And what he told me later, I can see a few strands of that in your book. It's still not declassified, that operation. I believe it's an active thing. It's a top secret plan. But in the circumstances that we are in, you've touched upon it. Operation Hammerhead. What exactly was that? And that actually, a lot of respect to General Sundarji for even thinking of something like that.
It was part of Brasstacks on Operation Trident, if they called it. So there's another theory, that Brasstacks was just a smoke screen. Smoke screen for India to launch Trident. What was Trident? What was Hammerhead? The idea, and I'll just give you a brief, that the idea was to use tanks and also paratroopers to land inside the Pakistani lines and recapture areas from Pakistan occupied Kashmir in Gilgit and Skardu. And that was the only time this plan was actually brought to the starting point. And it was actually, it was about to be operationalized, and it was to land troopers inside and take out a few areas of Pakistan occupied Kashmir, while the forces of Pakistan were concentrated down south across the Rajasthan border, across the Punjab border, which we spoke about. The idea was to do that. So there is a debate about whether this exercise was just about Brasstacks and India testing its capabilities, or actually launching an attack into Pakistan. So it was always divided. My belief, and I'll stand by my understanding of it, is that the thought was to provoke Pakistan and to make the first move, wherein we had the excuse to drive into Pakistan and do what we had to do or what he had planned to do. Because of Trident, what happened was there was the Indian the attaché in Pakistan got a call late in the night, SK Singh, and he was summoned. He's saying that he was summoned to by the Pakistanis, and he was told that, look, what are you guys doing? We hear that there are, and so they were really rattled. Which is after the call and after these negotiations with him, General Zia flew into India. But one of the things that happened, and because of Trident, the Hammerhead plan that you spoke about, the Brasstacks and the entire thing, General Zia, once he comes here, he goes back and all of these talks started. Somebody in Pakistan, and all the powers that we talk about, the others in Pakistan who were propped up by the Americans, they were also involved in whatever happened later. 9 months later, a helicopter takes off with Ziaul Haq from Bahawalpur. C-130. Box of mangoes are loaded into the helicopter. You should read a book called Mohammed Hanif's book, Case of Exploding Mangoes. And Zia's plane crashes, not a helicopter. The plane crashes, C-130 crashes, and Zia is dead. The story doesn't end there, because few years later, General Sundarji has retired and he's in Paris in 1994, and he is invited to dinner by the American ambassador to India in 1988, who had also retired and settled in Paris, Jean Gunther Dean. John Gunther Dean and his wife arrive, called Mrs. Sundarji and General Sundarji over for dinner. He leans across the table and he asks General, who do you think killed Zia? General Sundarji has a smirk on his face. Don't you know, it was you, the Americans.
But this is fascinating, Probal. I see an OTT series in this. So if anyone hears, they have Netflix, Amazon Prime, Probal is available after this to talk about this, because it is a fascinating story. And when you said 5 assassinations and a gun deal, I was actually picturing a plane with a lot of people in it. The plane crashes, everybody dies, one man steps out of the wreckage, and that's General Sundarji. He's the only person to have kind of walked out of the 80s alive into the 90s.
Yes.
He's seen Mrs. Gandhi, he's seen Rajiv Gandhi, he's seen Ziaul Haq, Olof Palme, all of those assassinations, and he walks into the 90s. But before I come to the 90s, there's a very big turning point there. He launched the Indian Army into another direction. I mean, like you said, the anti-status quo chief first launches against Pakistan. Then he goes to one area that we've never been to in 4 decades, because we were so absolutely terrified of the 10-foot tall Chinaman. What do we do in the Northeast?
This was very interesting, because what had happened was that after 1962, the Chinese had gained a psychological advantage. And they kind of leveraged it very often, that we will teach you a lesson. I think we've all heard that line in the Chinese media. India will be taught a lesson. That was something that was very, frequently, sort of spoken of by the Chinese media, by the Chinese leaders. 67, there were 2 battles in India in which India triumphed, and that's what could push back the Chinese.
That's your book, Watershed.
Watershed and 67. Those are the 2 lesser known battles, but that kind of paved the way for the non-participation of the Chinese in 1971, when India and Pakistan went to war, and the Chinese could have cut off the Siliguri corridor. Again, if you think of the Indian map, the Siliguri corridor is a narrow strip of land on the eastern part of India, but let's not go there. They could have done that. All of these things had happened in the past, and yet, in the 1980s, the Chinese still held an advantage. There was thinking amongst the Indian strategic thinkers, politicians, military officers, military generals, everywhere, that the Chinese always held the advantage. It was very difficult to put it across China in the military domain, which was, and you spoke about the 10-foot tall Chinese soldier, which was something that occupied our minds forever. In the 1980s, again, I spoke about how Mrs. Gandhi, she took the call to, have defenses created along the border, beefed up. Uh, General Sundarji had another theory to this. He was speaking of dissuasive deterrence. Now I'll deorganize it. Dissuasive deterrence meant that you could deploy in the forward areas and not have defenses in depth only. So because of 1962, we were always on the defensive. General Sundarji was always a front foot player. We are in the city of cricket. So he wanted to ensure that India was always on the front foot. He was someone who held. So when he was in 1987, Arunachal Pradesh was announced as a state that rattled the Chinese, that set off the cat amongst the pigeons as far as the Chinese were concerned. Well, we had a possible barter with India where the Chinese could take Arunachal and could give Sachin back to India. That was something that had been going on forever, that thought, that those debates.
That's a Nehru and Chowdhury.
Yes, but that was brought to a close by the announcement of Arunachal Pradesh as a state in 1987. That irked the Chinese very much. They moved troops close to the Arunachal border. Where? They moved troops to the same place where 1962 happened, just to rub salt into the wounds, just to regain that kind of psychological initiative, the psychological advantage. They play a lot of mind games. They did that. That was near Sondarumchu. That was near the Thagla Ridge from 1962. This was also to tell India that we can come and sit on your land at any point of time. So one of the patrols saw 50 Chinese one day, moved up to a number of 100, 200. India was concerned. General Sundarji wanted to beef up the defenses. So he goes to the area and is briefed by General James Singh, who was the division commander. This is to also bring out the thinking that was prevalent then. James Singh says, sir, it will take us months because we need to access these heights and our mules will have to carry this load and it'll take these many months, these many weeks because the mule loads are so many and these are guns and equipment and munitions and supply, etc. It takes so much time. We won't be able to put up our defenses in a very short time. So General Sundarji looks at him. He says, in this age, you two talking of mules, speak of helicopters. Because traditionally, the army has moved through backpack mules and you had mules carrying all of this equipment up the mountains. But here was General Sundarji challenging that protocol, that practice. So an entire brigade was heli-lifted to Zimikar. About 4,000 troops were heli-lifted and helipads were created. Within 3 weeks, thousands of Indian soldiers were up on the ridges. What was the change? In 1962, the Chinese had occupied the heights, the Indians were on the floor. There's a metaphor there. The Chinese were on the heights, the Indians were on the floor. A quarter of a century later, the Indians were on the heights, the Chinese were on the floor. They were rattled, and that is how they were pushed back without firing a bullet.
In a sense, you got the upper hand in the Chinese in escalation dominance. That's what you achieved.
Yes.
And that was hailed as a very successful operation, as you outlined. Taking no one thought that the Indian Army had that brigade lift capability back then in the 80s. And then he swings south to Sri Lanka. Do you think it was what happened with Operation Checkerboard? Or
yes, that was when he heli-lifted all of this. Yeah.
Or Checkerboard would have kind of given him a sense that Sri Lanka was nothing, the LTT was nothing. Do you think that happened?
Yes. I was, you spoke about General Bulbul Birar, who lives here. I spent half a day with him talking about Blue Star. But similarly, when I went and had a long morning session with General P.B. Malik, who you'd be familiar with, he was India's army chief during Kargil. So General Malik was General Sundarji's staff officer. Then when this happened, so he walks into the room and he says, "Sir, we are hearing from the media that India would possibly be intervening in the civil war in Sri Lanka." So General Sundarji was quite, given the flamboyance that he had, he said, "Well, we'll take care of it. Don't worry, we'll figure it out." So yes, it was the highs of Somdurumchu that led him to the swamps of Jaffna, but on a horse of hubris. And I think that is where the mistake was made, because when Rajiv Gandhi, who was the Prime Minister, called people, then he said, if you were to send Indian peacekeeping troops to Sri Lanka, what would be your opinion? And if we have to fight the entities, Sundarji said, it'll take us a couple of weeks to decimate and complete the job. So his offhand thinking, his decision, his sudden decision, his instinctive, impulsive call to go to Sri Lanka was based on what he had experienced in Somdurumchu. There is a little anecdote that I want to talk about. That it's a long one, we have time, I guess. So, and it includes some of the other characters which you'd be familiar with. Prabhakaran. Okay, so that's and it's a bit of an irony at the end of it, so you'll know. The older amongst us will recall some of the incidents and link up, and I'll leave it at that. So, the India-Sri Lanka Accord was to be signed. And I'll tell you why Sundarji is important here. The India-Sri Lanka Accord was to be signed, and Rajiv Gandhi and Jawahardlal were to do it. But there were several stakeholders in Sri Lanka who were to be brought on board. They were brought on board, the political stakeholders, the military stakeholders, the Sri Lankan government, etc. And for the accord, there was one stakeholder that hadn't agreed. So they wanted to get that stakeholder, the dissenting stakeholder, into play. So a helicopter lands in Jaffna. In that helicopter travels the second secretary there in Colombo, the Indian High Commission. So he lands there, a few people come to it's a hush-hush thing. Few people land, people will come to the helicopter, sit in the helicopter. One of them is Prabhakaran, and a couple of others sit with him. So some of these other guys who are traveling with him ask the Indian bureaucrat, would he be safe? We don't even know where he's going. The Indian bureaucrat says, don't worry, we'll bring him here, back to you, safe and sound. So they fly to they fly to Madras, for a stopover to take the flight to Delhi, and they stop over in Madras, and they're at the airport ordering food. So, and the Indian bureaucrat is Hardeep Singh Puri. So just FYI. So, he's sitting with Prabhakaran, and Hardeep Puri orders chicken and chapati. So Prabhakaran says, I'll have that too. So Hardeep Puri asks him, why chapati? I thought you guys had rice down there in Sri Lanka. Prabhakaran says, no, I don't have rice, because having rice slows down the finger on my trigger. Makes you sleepy. So, anyways, to cut the story short, so they fly to Delhi, and they meet Rajiv Gandhi, and Prabhakaran doesn't want to let go of his cyanide capsule. So he wants to go and meet the Prime Minister like that. So they had to have 2 tables across, and they had to have the security hovering around them all the time. And he actually met the Prime Minister with the cyanide capsule. So that happened there. After the event, and so Prabhakaran is brought on board. Everybody is happy. Prabhakaran is brought on board. Pranab Mukherjee differed there, but he was told that, no, you are too much of a pessimist. Let's celebrate. Prabhakaran is on board for peace, we are all good. They were actually barking up the wrong tree. Prabhakaran was not very happy with the Delhi visit anyways. At the end of the party, Rajiv Gandhi was seeing him off, and while Prabhakaran leaves after giving his consent, his reluctant consent to the accord, Rajiv Gandhi calls Rahul, his son. He says, wait a minute, Rahul, why don't you go inside and get something that I've kept on the chair? Rahul goes inside, brings something across to Rajiv Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi wraps it around Prabhakaran and tells him, wear this, it will keep you safe. It's a bulletproof jacket. Where's the irony? Few years later, Rajiv Gandhi is killed by Prabhakaran. That's the irony of this thing.
I remember reading that, and Probal, the lady who assassinated, the suicide bomber, was wearing a jacket that was packed with explosives. So that was like a reference to, that is a twist, a very cruel, ironical twist there.
Can I also add Sundarji's role there? So, when Prabhakaran leaves Delhi, he goes back to Jaffna. He goes back to his people, and he is accompanied by an army officer who goes there and who goes with Prabhakaran. He's a Tamil officer, and he comes back and he is able to converse with Prabhakaran and his aides in the journey. So he comes back to Delhi and he's sitting. He goes to a briefing room where General Sundarji and the other chiefs are sitting there. General Sundarji has already made up his mind to go into Sri Lanka. When this officer comes back and briefs the three chiefs, there's Admiral Tehliani, there's General Sundarji. Admiral Tehliani is the father of Tarun Tehliani, for many of you would know. And so the three chiefs are sitting there, and when the officer briefs them, he says, so General Sundarji asks, what do you think? So he differs. Colonel Madan Gopal Iyengar is his name. So he differs and he says, well, I don't think this peace is possible. So Sundarji says, oh, you don't know much. He dismisses him. He dismisses the young officer's views. He says, you have no idea. He says, no, sir, this is what I think. I saw 16-year-olds, 14-year-olds travel with cyanide capsules in the plane, and these are not people who are signing up for a long time peace. These are people who are willing to die, and you are getting them on the table for peace. I don't think this war is going to be a short-lived one. They are not going to be signing for peace. We are going to have a long-drawn conflict. But his views, Madan Gopal Iyengar's views, was cast aside by General Sundarji, who had, like we discussed earlier, who had reached a state of hubris that, what I would think of couldn't be challenged by anybody else here. That is how it happened. And so we went into Sri Lanka. When I was writing the book, I get a call in the morning at 7 early morning, says, are you writing the book, I hear? I said, yes. Who are you? He says, can you spend 30 minutes with me? I want to tell you something important, what happened. I said, yes, I have more than 30 minutes, much more. Tell me. He says, I am General Madan Gopal Iyengar, who flew with Prabhakaran back to Madras from Delhi. And I spent a lot of time speaking with him, which comes out in the story about what happened when he comes back, and what is the conversation he's had with Prabhakaran and his aides when he comes back to do a feedback.
And again, what a fascinating story. You've just taken me back into time, Probal. I'm sure everyone here in the audience who was growing up in the 80s will agree. There's something else. There's another story that's running on a parallel track, and that is the arms deal. The newspapers in the 1980s, when I was in school, I remember every day you had Ram Jethmalani asking those 10 questions in the Indian Express, right? What was General Sundarji's role in the Bofors scandal? As in, of course, it was about the selection of the gun. He did not want the FH-77B as his first choice, right? What made him change it in favor of Bofors?
Right. So, I know I run the risk of being cliched by calling him Destiny's Child again and again. But in the early 1980s, he was in Delhi as a deputy chief, then he was again back to Delhi as a vice chief, and then as a chief. So he had seen almost half a decade of acquisitions, and the entire plan for armaments and guns, etc. What had happened is, if you step outside this a little bit, the Soviets had come to Afghanistan in 1980. And when that happened, India had started to get a lot of cheap and a lot of Soviet equipment at reasonable and cheap rates, which which was something that India wanted to, quickly have. The Soviets needed India here. So strategically poised, geographically well poised, India was the beneficiary of some of those geopolitical moves that had happened then, and Sundarji was the deputy chief early on, early part of the decade. So the plan was to have these big, artillery guns, and the idea was to look at three or four options. We had Bofors as one of them. We had the French soft-ma gun. We had the Austrian gun, and we had the English gun. The Austrian gun had the longest range, but it had suffered some barrel bursts in its tests. So initially, when Sundarji was in the army headquarters, he had toured many of these countries. He'd come back saying Bofors was number 3 on the list. There was the Austrian gun, the French soft-ma gun, and Bofors. This is how it went. The question, and normally sometimes there's always a controversy around things that happen, and you want to have everybody pulled into that controversy. But when you sort of segregate the threads, you realize that there is a nuanced bit which is there in the deal. And that nuance is Sundarji's choice of that gun initially was the Austrian gun because of the range. And as I said, because the barrel bursts happened during exercises and during the tests, that gun was cast aside. The French soft-ma gun was next in line. But the French soft-ma gun suffered from the disadvantage of the fact that the Americans had given gun locating radars to Pakistan, which meant that the French soft-ma gun could not be given to India anymore because it was compromised. Then came Bofors. It did not necessarily mean that Bofors was a bad gun. Sundarji has always and consistently maintained that. So there were two parts of the thing, the gun and the deal, like we have in this auditorium, the left and the right side. So you had the gun and the deal. So, the gun was good, and the deal had its issues. And which is what he maintains all through the process, the way the kickbacks were given, etc. So General Sundarji's view on the gun was consistent right from the start. He was dragged into the controversy. As much as I blame him for Sri Lanka, as much as I find faults with him on jumping General Vaidya to get Mrs. Gandhi on his side, I think he was one of the few people who came out clean in Bofors. And can you tell me what was the amount that we're talking about, the kickbacks amount, which actually brought down an entire government? Yeah, this side has all the answers. I'm sure you have to. 64 crores. So, but then that was decided. The decision to actually go with Bofors was decided on a morning walk where Olof Palme and Rajiv Gandhi go out for a morning walk in Delhi, and this is how deals happen. So they said, you know what, let's seal the deal, let's go for it. So, and the deal happened. What happened a few days later, and I have it from one of the sources, who was a young boy who goes to one of the Delhi hotels with his father, and he says, well, he told me when I went to that hotel with my father, the entire hotel was booked because the Bofors staff was coming there. So it was all done and dusted. So they were, and Vinchata. So all of these people were there, and this deal was going on. But Olof Palme's story, just like Zia's story, and somebody talked about Olof Palme's death as well, that's a very interesting one as well. So Olof Palme's party was on the back foot, and they needed something to a deal, and Bofors was pressurizing the party because they were the funders of that party as well. So when Bofors happened, it was aired on the Swedish radio that people had taken kickbacks, etc. And that age was a non-technology age. In 24 hours, everybody knew what was happening with Bofors. Absolutely astounding. But Olof Palme, a few months later, he goes to a movie theater. He's returning from a movie theater with his wife. Somebody pops up on the road, shoots him dead. Olof Palme's death, Bofors, Sundarji. Sundarji takes the call for Bofors. Unfortunately, it also leads to the death of Olof Palme. So that's the fifth assassination, but that's how it goes.
What a fascinating story, Probal. And and full marks to you to put it down there, and you completely disproved my skepticism from last year. I must compliment you on putting this book together. Destiny's Child, the anti-status quoist general, the most important general in India's history. Of course, you're skirting whether Field Marshal Manekshaw is in the race or no. We'll talk about that later. But I think we must open the floor now. We have about 10 minutes for questions, question and answers. I request you to keep your questions very short.
The city of Mumbai welcomes you also, Sandeep.
तो मेरा घर है यार.
Great. Welcome again. I heard from Shekhar Gupta that after his retirement, General Sundarji also used to write a column in the Indian Express, which incidentally would be called as the Brasstacks. Could you comment on some of his writings and his, because I think one bigger contribution to the national security ecosystem is also some of his writings and conference appearances. And if I'm not wrong, was he also involved in track 2 dialogues, or am I wrong?
You have to buy the book and read all that. He's not going to reveal everything. That's why I didn't ask him over the nuclear question also. But Probal, over.
Yeah, thank you. So General Sundarji was involved, and like Sandeep said, we have an entire epilogue, and the last couple of chapters deal with the nuclear doctrine, how he articulated the nuclear doctrine. He also wrote a document called Vision 2020. He wrote about how the future would look like. He wrote about the fact that there would be a rise of China. He wrote about it in 1991. He wrote about the rise of China. He wrote about the decline of the Soviet Union, which had declined then. But he said that China would come up. He spoke about a world run by the Americans, where the Chinese would want to win back their space as a civilization. He wrote about it then. He spoke about the rise of nationalism. He spoke about the rise of some of these middle powers. And he also said by 2015, India would be a middle power. Whether India aspires to be a superpower will be known by then, but that's debatable. Let's understand he's writing about it 3.5 decades ago. So he had this visionary ability, the ability to gaze through a crystal ball. As I said earlier, he's somebody who took his call, never held back from doing so. He never thought that, well, I'm writing this, what if I'm proved wrong? No, he wrote about this because he also wanted to understand something and help people understand that, your objective is to do this. And he wrote about how high technology warfare, hybrid warfare would evolve over a period of time. He wrote about that. He was, again, a little anecdote, in 1994, he was in Washington, D.C., and he was at a conference where the Pakistanis were around. And I wouldn't tell you the entire story, it's there in the book. And the Pakistani diplomat was not very pleased and rather still not very sure of having Sundarji in the same room in the seminar there. They were still rattled by what happened in Brasstacks. Sundarji was invited by Pakistan after his retirement, invited by China, and when he lands in Islamabad, General Asif Nawaz Janjua, who was the Pakistani chief before that, during Sundarji's time in India, end of that time, he says, is it the legendary General Sundarji that I'm meeting? I've heard a lot about you and I wanted to meet you all the time. So they had high regards for him. They also had their views on him. I must say, this book, I sent the manuscript to Hussain Haqqani, who was a Pakistani ambassador, to the US long back, which is a non-entity in Pakistan. Anybody who's thinking right is probably wrong. Non-entity in Pakistan today.
He's back, practically in exile.
Yeah,
He'll go back.
Yeah. So I thought, the Pakistani ambassador would probably read my manuscript and wouldn't say much about it or wouldn't reply. And lo and behold, Hussain Haqqani writes back to me. He says, I would like to write about Sundarji. He was a man after my heart. So he writes a blurb for me as well. So yes, he cut across all the spaces and bought it.
Yes.
Probal, from what I've read of your book, General Brasstacks so far, I'm trying to understand a little more about his leadership qualities. And while you said he's Destiny's Child, there's a series of very important events that he's had to deal with, decision making specifically, and unconventional at that. Could you comment on, to what extent his unconventional decisions have helped India or the outcome of these important events?
Yeah, thanks, Ravi. There are two kinds of consequences that are there of decisions that you have. One are the intended consequences, and the other are the unintended consequences. As a leader, the first part of your question, as a leader, I'll be brief and short because we also have perhaps other questions. He was decisive, impulsive, at times reckless, but he was not somebody who would be quiet. And there was a clarity of thought in his head. There was no source that I went to who said, I have no opinion on General Sundarji. They always had something to say, either good or bad. So for a man who divided opinions, sparked debates, and brought people to be thinking about him, he was a leader who had shaped, like I said earlier, he shaped a lot of these national decisions, political decisions. As a leader, again, he was somebody, and he wrote a letter for everyone. He wrote a letter when he became chief, and he circulated that letter across the army. And that letter had many important points from a behavioral conduct point of view, from a leadership point of view, on why and how one should, keep their heads high. One should be, about integrity, about, what we talk about today, about dissing the peripheral fluff stuff. And General Sundarji was focused on the core. So he said a large part, and he's been critical of the organization when he writes the letter. He's critical of the practices in the army then. He says, we must do away with some of these things. These don't help. The entire, obsession with bureaucracy, the entire obsession with some of these things, he said, we must have a leaner way of looking at things. So it is then that he wrote. So he spoke about leadership. The unintended consequences was that we spoke about Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka had lots of casualties, lots of deaths, but it also created an entire set of 80,000 officers and troops who were ready when insurgency came calling in Kashmir in the decade that followed. Those who were captains in Sri Lanka were, majors in Kashmir. Those who were majors in Sri Lanka were colonels and battalion commanders. So you had an entire set of experienced professionals ready in Kashmir when insurgency happened in the 1990s. That was an unintended consequences of leadership calls. So your leadership call will always have the positive side and the negative side. He did not get cowed down because there's something negative coming out of it. He took a call because on the basis of the information that we had at that point of time, we thought what was correct and correct.
We have time for exactly one question. Yes.
Sir, can I...
Yeah, just keep it short. Okay, I'll take one more. Just take one more and then we'll wrap up. Yes. So you want to start? Yeah.
Sure. Sir, my question is on, as a contemporary historian dealing with a lot of data which could be classified or a lot of... Sir, as a contemporary historian dealing with politically sensitive topics, and probably a lot of this would have been classified information at a point in time, and writing certain content may be internationally volatile, domestically volatile, personal. How do we balance academic integrity, data research, and public sensitivities / political sensitivities? My question is on historiography, not so much on the book, because that would help a lot of us who want to probably, get into research.
So I would answer this slightly differently, and I'll be brief. I'm a big fan and advocate of declassifying our documents. Why do you think the American research and scholarship has been miles ahead? Let's accept that. We haven't reached that stage. The reason is that they have been open to scholarship. They've been opening their libraries, and there is a declassification model that is followed. We don't have it, and I'm very much a big advocate of that. And only then we have to open it up to civilian professional scholars as well, as much as military scholars, to research all of these history and other documents.
And the gentleman there. Yes. Can you have a just one question? That's very. So please keep your question very short.
Yeah. Sir, during this LTT war, we have sent peacekeeping force. So how much military loss we had and financial loss we had at that time? Any mentioning is there, sir?
It is in the book, and there's a, like I said, there were large losses. And
Sir, I just make one point. I am Colonel Narayan. I am from battalion of General Sundarji, to Maha. He was commissioned in our battalion. So what I can give you a glimpse is that as a soldier, as an officer, he was absolutely a regimental officer, and he was very forward-looking. Even when he was in the battalion, he used to write papers which were
Yes.
10 years ahead.
Thank you, Colonel Narayan. Thank you very much, Probal. What an engaging discussion. Thank you.